Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're here with Scott Horton, the author of Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, and Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. You're the host of the Scott Horton Show, former or still host of Anti-War Radio. That's where I first discovered you a long time ago, but 15 years ago.
Yeah, still doing KPFK every Sunday morning.
All right. Wanted to talk to you because you've been following this for as long as I have been, and that's been for me my entire adult life. So where are we now in regards to the problems of the war on terror now that Biden has, for whatever reason, ramped down Afghanistan?
Well, that's a great question. There was a time in the Obama years where they talked about amending the authorization to use military force so they could add the term associated forces. That way they could go after groups like Al-Shabaab or go after ISIS when they weren't directly related to Al-Qaeda that had done September 11th. But then they decided, well, whatever, we'll just do whatever we want. And they never did add associated forces. And yet they fight as though they have authorization to go after anyone who essentially is a Sunni with a rifle who doesn't work for a government anywhere in the world. And, it's pretty dishonest. It's essentially an excuse to keep the thing going. But if you look at, where we have troops, the troops in Syria are not really fighting ISIS. I guess they are, allied with the Kurds there, and whatever small remnants of ISIS there, they might, attack them from time to time. But as they admit, they're really there to keep the government of Syria impoverished. The secular but Shiite aligned government of Syria from cashing in on their oil revenue or feeding their wheat to their people, by keeping that under wraps and, propping up the Kurds in the northeast of the country there, to keep really the entire east half of the country, or very much of it, independent from Damascus there. If you look at the situation in Iraq, they claim that they're there to fight ISIS, but they're not doing very much fighting of ISIS. I think the last mission that they supposedly went on against radical Sunni insurgents there was more than a year ago. They've got bases in Iraqi Kurdistan and, are officially allied with the Shiite government there. Although, as Trump put it, we're really there to keep an eye on Iran, not the bin Ladenite, Sunni extremists, but the Shiites. And the same government we're allied with, the same government W. Bush put in power there, the same government that Obama helped build up ISIS to spite them and then destroyed ISIS on their behalf once it got out of control and created the caliphate in 2014. So, in other words, in Iraq and Syria, there's a pretext of being there to fight bin Ladenites, but they're really there for the Shiites, the ones that they wish they hadn't fought Iraq War II and III for, but here we are.
So what
in Yemen, we fight against the Shiites, against the Houthis, on behalf of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, directly on their behalf, in a way that you can't really say that in Iraq and Syria at this point. But in Yemen, essentially, they're the third leg on the stool of Saudi and UAE power. Or the third out of four, if America is one of them. The other is Al-Qaeda on the ground there. They've been a massive boon to the UAE's militia force on the ground. And, for the first couple of years of the war, they took over 10 towns, including the port city of Makalla in, relatively the east of the country there, and made billions of dollars and stole, who knows what all kind of military equipment and so forth from the military bases that they conquered. Just across the Red Sea, we still fight Al-Shabaab because one of them cracked a joke one time that he was loyal to Al-Qaeda or something like that. Their most internationally ambitious leader, Godane, was killed in 2012. Maybe it was 14. I think it was 12. And so, it might have been 14. But anyway, that was still, almost a decade ago, and 8 years ago, something like that. And they have essentially no international ambitions. Whenever they've striked at targets in Kenya or Ethiopia or across any international borders, it's still locally, and those have all been direct revenge, reprisal type attacks across the borders. But they're not really internationalist bin Ladenites. And if America abandoned Somalia, the government we propped up there would fall. But the chances that al-Shabaab would take over that country and rule it effectively for any meaningful period of time is highly doubtful. And, they had bin Ladenites try to take over part of Somalia in the 1990s, and everybody just ignored them to death, and they went away. Locals took care of it. Yeah, Somalis aren't used to living like Saudis and don't want to. And then throughout the rest of North Africa, I mean, they're chasing the consequences of the Libya war, which again was fought on behalf of the bin Ladenites, Ansar al-Sharia and the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and other groups like that. And they chased the consequences of that, disastrous aggressive war in Libya into Mali, and then it spread into Sierra Leone and Chad and Niger and Burkina Faso, where these jihadist groups have carried on their violence through. But essentially the U.S. is embedding with these special operations forces in these other countries and training them. But they can handle these problems themselves. They don't need the American intervention there. And in fact, in two recent cases, in Sierra Leone and I forgot what was the other one, they just had a couple of military coups in Africa led by American trained soldiers, just like what happened in Mali in 2013. As soon as the jihadists left Libya and came down to Mali to hijack the Tuareg revolution, American trained officers overthrew the democratically elected government. They haven't had a democracy since. Oh, that may not be true. I think they may have held elections since then, but it's certainly been worse than it was. And they've had war essentially in northern Mali this whole time, with the French doing most of the heavy lifting for the Americans there, although special operations forces have been there, Delta and Green Berets have been there too. So, think of it like this. The Army and the Air Force want a Cold War with Russia. And the Navy and the Air Force want a Cold War with China. And the Marines, I guess, are along for the ride in the Pacific, basically. But the Special Operations Forces, they want their own separate war in Africa and wherever they can get some in the Middle East. Like, say, for example, the Houthis outright win the war against Saudi Arabia, and Crown Prince Bonesaw there goes home with his tail between his legs. Now we have a Shiite government that rules in Sana'a, and for that matter, hypothetically, down to the port of Aden. Now we have a massively increased Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula presence there. That war on terrorism. Let's say you got a new president. Let's say Biden gets replaced by brand X Republican governor from the Midwest somewhere. And he goes, well, I thought we were fighting Al-Qaeda. And he wants to have a war on Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Same place, pick up where Obama left off when he switched sides in the war in 2015, right? But go back to fighting Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And that could be a whole war. That could be a huge task. You could devote, massive special operations forces and CIA forces to an effort like that. You probably wouldn't send in a massive infantry invasion, but you could have, what was AQAP has been essentially an empowered militia, armed and trained and supported by the UAE for the last 4 years or something. So I don't know exactly what they're going to look like at the end of this, but they'll be the most powerful Al-Qaeda group in history. We still do have, I mentioned ISIS in Syria, but we still have Al-Qaeda. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they call themselves now. It essentially rules the Idlib province. They have their own little bin Ladenite mini state in the Idlib province in northwestern Syria under the protection of America and the Turks. And, with enough pressure there to keep the Syrian government and the Russian government from finishing the war there, and, accepting the surrender of or killing off the rest of the bin Ladenites. And so, the number one thing that America needs to do to, protect the American people from bin Ladenite terrorism is first and foremost, stop backing them. And then secondly, recognize that it's the policy of dominance over there that has these guys fighting against us in the first place. And, if the Americans would renounce their policy of dominance in the Middle East, we wouldn't have a terrorism problem anyway. Hezbollah used suicide attacks against the Israelis until the Israelis withdrew from Lebanon, and then they stopped. The last one was in 1999. And it always was the foreign policy that motivated them to attack us. People said that no, we hate them because they're Muslim, and we just want to humiliate them and all these things because our religion makes us hate Muslims. We would say, what are you, stupid? They attacked us. They knocked our towers down. They killed our people. They tried to sink our battleship. They, slaughtered our airmen in their barracks. It was the violence that made us do it. Well, that's the same thing. You tell them, oh, no, you just hate them because they're Christians. You just hate them because they're white. You just hate them because they love freedom and their mama. And they go, no, it was the bombing. It was the blockade and bombing of Iraq from bases in Saudi Arabia. It was support for Israel and their violent suppression of the Palestinians and their occupation of southern Lebanon. It's the support for military dictatorships and monarchies in the region. And, all of the rest of these things. They said it over and over again. And I made that crack on, if you saw in the debate with Bill Kristol, about how I just recently went back and watched the CNN interview of Osama bin Laden and the whole special there from 1996. Nobody said anything about hating freedom. The whole story was, well, they hate us for our bases in Saudi Arabia and our support for Israel. There wasn't any debate about it. That was exactly what it was. It was completely not controversial at all. And for people who knew about Al-Qaeda and bin Laden for years before September 11th, it was like, what do you mean they hate us for our freedom? We already know what they said. They said they want us the hell out of their holy land.
Yeah. It's been wild to watch this because I have watched left media become more and more incoherent on these points. And by left media, I broadly mean Democratic Party adjacent media, but I also do mean like socialist media. Why you were one of the first people to call that Obama, even to what mild anti-war bromides he gave, and people should have listened to what he actually said, right? Because he said, for example, that they weren't getting out of Afghanistan. That was stated on the campaign trail.
That's
right. You were one of the people who called how fast a lot of his supporters would give up pushing against him on that. Why do you think the U.S. left has been so anemic on these issues? Is it cynical, or do a lot of the people not understand what's going on, or both?
Yeah, I mean, it's partisanship is a huge part of it, but also, you know what? I got to learn a bunch of Arabic names and dates and places and stuff. It's just, as Luke Skywalker said, it's a long way from here. And so people have, their own concerns. And look, I mean, this is the paradox of the American empire, right? Is the American people are essentially the grandsons and great-grandsons of the people who fled the old world so they could come here and be free and mind their own damn business. The idea that we would be the world empire is completely alien to what our culture is supposed to be about. So you have vast majority of America, of the American population, would just as soon let the world go on. They don't care. Or, if they care, it doesn't mean they want to intervene. Doesn't mean they think it's their business to rule over other people. And if you told them that the Americans are the world empire, they might be surprised to hear that. That, okay, well, I guess they do call us a superpower and whatever, but what does that really mean? Well, it means we're the dominant political and military power on the face of the planet, or else is what that means. And so, you have the paradox of, people who just want to mind their own business end up being completely negligent when it comes to overseeing their government's responsibility for carrying out all this violence in the world, and then, ultimately though, what am I fighting for? Why do I even bother with this stuff? It's because I want to be free so I can just live my life and mind my own business. I'm worried though that in a collapsing world empire, I'm going to lose my freedom. And world empire at all collapsing or on the upswing or down, either way. So I'm taking time out of my life to try to put this to bed and put it aside and get back to just riding my skateboard with my friends and, being a decent, happy person like everybody else. So to give people the benefit of the doubt, they don't care because they're trying to care about things that are more important to them, closer to home, people that they can help closer to home, they think. I don't know. But then, just like with everything, man, the other guys are worse. And what do you think we should do? Abandon our side right when the other side is on the verge of getting away with all the things that they want to do? And so, grin and bear it. That's why we have these two giant left and right coalitions in this country of interest groups that don't have too much to do with each other, that ally in these two coalitions. It's 51% winner take all for every race in the country, pretty much. I guess California has that ridiculous, in fact, look how they do it with this stupid ranked voting thing where only Democrats can ever win ever again, in the top two voting system they have. But anyway, essentially, swallow your disagreements with the side you're on because the other side wants your guns, or the other side doesn't want your guns, or whatever the stupid wedge issue is. And then, they're not all stupid, right? They're important wedge issues. But whatever the issues are that keep people on their side. And so, I saw this, and the reason I was able to predict so badly that liberals and Democrats would do under Biden was because I saw the same exact thing happen to Republicans after Clinton. In the Bill Clinton years, even G. Gordon Liddy, the right-wing former FBI agent, Watergate conspirator, said that the ATF and the FBI were jackbooted thugs, that they were essentially the Gestapo, that their authority was illegitimate and needed to be severely rolled back. And then what happened was, and he was speaking for the American right, and people were really pissed off and they were really anti-government. And then somebody, Bill Clinton, invented, I put that lightly, invented, but for the sake of our argument here, invented the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Oh, God. Now what's wrong with the government? Bill Clinton's in charge of it. And all we need to do is get rid of him. And then they replaced him not even with Ronald Reagan's son, but just George Bush's son, right? That'd be like if they elected Mike Pence's son. And all the right-wingers were so loyal to him. Why? Because he's the son of a guy who knew the guy you love so much or whatever, But boy, once W. Bush came in, and he's the dumbest of Bush's sons, by the way, too. Neil got in trouble because he was a gangster embezzling a bunch of money from a bank. And Jeb, is kind of a dumbass too, but he just was only a first-term governor in 2000. So it had to be W. But W's a cross-eyed moron and also a sniveling little brat and a narrow-minded, cruel little bastard. He's this horrible guy. Oh my God, they loved him so much because he wasn't Bill Clinton. Oh, the adults are back in charge now, bringing dignity back to the White House. Oh my God, these people. They're like Truman Democrats or something. It's the most sickening thing. And then, of course, even after when September 11th happened on their watch, that made them the greatest leaders of all time, beyond any question. When it came out there torturing people to death. That's okay. That's what a real patriot does. And that's what happened to the the anti-government right when the Republicans took power, 20 years ago. And then I saw the same thing coming with Barack Obama. I remember in 2008, I went to the Future Freedom Foundation conference, and I went to the little party thingy upstairs after. And I walk up, and there's Raimondo arguing with Greenwald. And this was like within that 3-week window when Raimondo was in love with Obama. And Raimondo's going, oh, I think he's so great. This is like in the spring of 2008, before the election, you know. And Raimondo's going, oh, I think he's so great. I heard him say an anti-war thing, and I liked it so much. And then Greenwald says to Raimondo, well, you know, I don't know. I think we got to reserve judgment, and we'll have to wait and see. And I walk up, and I'm like, you clowns, both of you, shut up. This guy's nothing but Bill Clinton. If he doesn't burn the, Waco to the ground, he's still going to escalate the war in Afghanistan. He already promised to. He's nothing but Hillary Clinton in drag. Are you kidding me? What in the world makes you think this guy is qualitatively better than John Edwards or Hillary Clinton in this thing? How could anyone believe that for a moment? And I'm not sure if I won that argument or not. I don't really remember much more about it than that. But I know I was right, that you'd have had to have been a damn fool to think. And in fact, if you ever remember the primaries, the way they ran it at the debate was over here. You have these monsters from the pit of hell, Hillary, Obama, and Edwards. And over here on the other side of the stage, segregated, separate away from the others, 2 human men, Dennis Kucinich and Mike Gravel. These guys care about America. These people care about themselves and representing the power elite. And it was just as obvious as it could be. There was no question about that. There was no question about that at all. And in fact, there was a great article in Newsweek that came out right after the election of 2008 that talked about how there was this very powerful faction of Democrats in the party, the top leadership, who hated the Clintons and were sick of the Clintons. And it was like a 50-50 split from the very top of the Democratic Party. And they saw Obama give his speech at the convention in 2004, the Kerry convention. And they walked right up to him and said, hey, how would you like to be president? And they started grooming him to run for president right after the convention of 2004. And so, when he was, I guess he had just gotten to the Senate, or he was even still running for the Senate.
He was running for the Senate. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was already the plan of half of the Democratic Party establishment elite from the beginning. Was in 2008, we're worried that the charisma-less Clinton is going to bog us down and not get it done. And so we're looking, how about you, tall, dark, and handsome? So this was a guy who was cultivated by them from the very beginning. He was no Dennis Kucinich, upstart insurgent, only tall, dark, and handsome. That's not what it was. He was always, essentially handed down from Mount Olympus. In fact, this is thank you to Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, especially. Screw Manning. But Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, they published in the State Department documents, in there is an email from an executive vice president at Citigroup in Chicago. And he picks Barack Obama's cabinet. He says, your cabinet, you're going to keep Secretary Robert Gates at Defense, Bush's man. You're going to make Hillary Clinton Secretary of State. And you're going to keep, Goldman Sachs as Treasury, Geithner, and on down the line. He picks him. It's right there in the WikiLeaks. You can see it. And that's who Barack Obama always was. And sorry, but anybody was a damn fool if they fell for that. Give me a break.
My own history there is actually somewhat similar in that I was a Gravel supporter, and then because Gravel went to the Libertarian Party and lost to Bob Barr, who I didn't trust, I backed Barack Obama until I saw his cabinet appointees, and then immediately was out. I was not surprised when he backed out of his promises on Gitmo. I was not surprised, pretty much anything, because it was definitely, even more than Biden, actually, we're not really going to change the guard. And what little bit of guard he did change, and you think about someone like Van Jones, right? Like, whatever you think of his politics, like Obama didn't stand up for him at all. Just threw him under the bus. So it was an interesting thing, even from the standpoint of like the institution of the Democratic Party, right? you had a new presidential administration that brought in almost no new blood to the party at all, despite having a pretty strong grassroots campaign amongst young people. Like,
in fact, I read a great thing about how, I don't remember the name of it anymore, but they had created this huge grassroots organization to funnel all these new Obama supporting Democrats into, because he was the best recruiter for the Democratic Party ever. And so he had sold it and had given speeches. You're going to have to keep pressure on them. Everybody join this group, and then you're going to kind of be the Barack Obama army out there, not in the right-wing conspiracy coup fear sense, but just you're going to be our activist army out there to pressure Congress and all the things that we want to do and all this. And as soon as they came into power, they ignored that organization to death. And all those people like ready to go and really believed in it and all of that stuff. But really, they're just giving people something more to believe in to get them to show up and vote, was all it was about. But once he got the election put away, they essentially dissolved that organization, which they, the idea was, from what they wanted's point of view, was they were going to be able to use this to really move the Democratic Party left, that they were going to be able to control the Democratic Party and make it adopt this much more progressive type agenda. And it was the first thing that they turned around and push back down the hill behind them. Thanks for letting me, climb on top of you. But it was essentially a sucker's game. They don't want democracy where like as many people as possible are participating in the system, trying to make it serve the interests of the public at large. That's not what's going on here,
I mean, it's interesting when you compare that to right now, where I think it should be clear to people that to some degree, Democrats, the mainstay of the Democratic Party has at least used its left similar to the way that the Tea Party was used by the Republicans, which is to create a momentum around what seems to be an internal opposition, promise them something that they never intend to give, but because the fight is always there, they're now hooked into a baited choice. Like the choices are now controlled. They're bounded.
That's right. Yep. Hey, you know what? I'll tell you what. There's this book is kind of a, conspiracy, right-wing conspiracy kooks Bible. It's called Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. And I won't get into all of that stuff, but he has this one take. It's a very elitist view where, he says should, like this is just his opinion. But I think what he's really doing is describing the American political system, not just as he sees it, but as the American Eastern establishment essentially conceived of it, at least in the mid-'60s when he wrote this. And I think it's pretty applicable today. He says, listen, the only reason that there should be two parties in America, one supposedly to represent the interests of the liberals and one to represent the conservatives, is essentially so that the American people can, ironic quotes, throw those rascals out every 8 or even 4 years if necessary, without ever leading to a substantial shift in policy. But when the current group in power becomes discredited and unpopular, they can be replaced by a fresh new team of people to continue to carry on essentially the same establishment consensus that we've decided is the priority. And then he goes ahead and lists all these things, none of them being, Article 1, Section 8, and all of them being, keep inflation going, but not too high, and keep the Atlantic Alliance at all costs, and, on and on and on with the Eastern establishment agenda, essentially. And so in that way, the way he's describing having two parties and having elections at all is simply an illusion. It's only there so that you're only really mad for 4 or 8 years max. And then we let you switch sides, take the pressure off. You get to be happy that your side won. And how do you like that, other guys? And now you get to be relieved for a while and let the other guys be mad. And then we just trade off back and forth, and you feel like half the time the system's working for you when, of course, it never is. And the really important part of that is that these establishment guys are a bunch of idiots. And apparently the more Harvard and Yale you go to, the less you know about anything. And so, for example, right now, and you're seeing I don't know if you ever look at Reddit. This is like the home of bad liberal takes, and leftist and progressive ones too. But when I say liberal, I mean center left, very Democratic Party kind of thinking. And boy, do they just have bad takes on everything. It's like, what a great channel to tune into to see where people misunderstand. But anyway, what they're complaining about is what everybody's complaining about. High prices. We have massive price inflation right now. We have massive price inflation because of massive monetary inflation. And so we have all across the country, people are striking. And they're striking because their wages are not keeping up with the cost of living. And then, of course, if they get a raise at all in their wages, we're talking especially hourly workers here and
about
lower level salaried workers. I'm sorry?
Yeah. It's usually about 1 to 1.5%. Like as a teacher, I know it. Like we usually underperform inflation. So.
Oh yeah, of course. And yeah, you'll never keep up with it. But when they do give you a raise at all, then they say, see, why rising wages is putting pressure on prices and causing prices to go up. No, it's just a lie. It's the government printing money. It's the government monetizing debt with new money and increasing the money supply that ends up devaluing the previous money. And the thing is, it doesn't just lead to high prices across the board. It leads to high prices in certain sectors, like, say, for example, .coms or housing or war. And then we have the crash comes due, just like in 2000 and 2008. And last year we had a massive crash that was forced by the lockdown, but we were overdue for one anyway. We've been 12 years on this massive inflationary bubble that we were overdue for the crash. You might remember Trump was essentially in a race to get reelected before the crash could come. And then the governors beat him to it. And the governors locked down the country and forced a recession anyway, which is a huge part of why he got unelected, even though it wasn't exactly his fault. He also was too stupid to run as the guy who's going to set you free. Instead, he was going, I'm the best lockdowner of all. And, completely confusing the message and all of that. But anyway, and now what do they do? And they locked the country down so bad, they forced such a bad recession that then they tried to fill the black hole that they'd created with trillions of new dollars. And, I read some statistics, and look, as an economist, I'm a great anti-war guy, but I read a thing that said 2/3, I've read a few things like this, 2/3 of all the American dollars ever created were created last year by the Federal Reserve, in order to try to make it seem like all this wealth hadn't been destroyed, because the paper money is still flowing into the economy. So that means we have these massive bubbles, and no one really understands why. And all people can do is say bosses are greedy, and bosses are raising prices so that they can make more profits and screw over the workers. And so here, everybody's, people are getting completely screwed, but they don't know why. And then so they don't know what policies to oppose or which ones to support. And everybody's just kind of lost in the dark. This happens over and over again. And in fact, like if you think about 2008, here we just lived through 8 years of W. Bush, who was, the compassionate conservative. In other words, one hair to the right of center on all economic policy, the welfare state, the regulatory state, and of course, inflation and spending. Dick Cheney famously said deficits don't matter in all of these things. And then that led to the crash of 2008. And then what they do? They pretended that W. Bush was Ron Paul. They pretended that we had just lived through the 20s, which even in the 20s, we had a central bank. The Federal Reserve was created in 1914. But remember the myth in government school, they teach you that we had a totally free market in the 20s, and that's what led to the Depression of the 30s. Well, they just replayed that same myth as though it hadn't been 80 years since the 30s, 70 years since the 30s. And here we are. We're going to pretend like George W. Bush was Mr. Laissez-faire free market economy with a hard money system and all this stuff. And so then they acted like they just had to start all over again, instead of, recognizing the way that the government had manipulated the currency and the economy during his time in order to lead to that crash. Anyway, I forgot how I got on this tangent, but it's just about the ignorance of the people on Reddit, how everybody's, they see what's in front of their nose, but they don't see why. No one ever explains to them how it got like this. I forgot who it was. Maybe it was Hazlitt or something that said, all of us suffer this boom bust cycle, but not 1 in 10,000 men can explain to you the monetary system and why it is this way. And by the way, one more thing about that. That's why then when the crashes come, dudes kill their families and then blow their own brains out because they're in total desperation because they can't provide for their people and they don't know that there are other people to blame. They think that they just weren't able to hack it and provide for their people and all this. And nobody gives them the information that they need to externalize the responsibility a bit where it belongs, on the people who boom and bust the economy over and over again. And so, people feel like they're total and complete failures, but then I guess the thinking is they'll be damned if they're going to let some other man come in and provide for their family. So they kill them all. And, as a news junkie, I'm sure you're the same way too. 2009, 2010, was it every single day in the paper? Murder, suicide everywhere, of people living in total desperation and putting all of the responsibility onto themselves to death, because nobody ever tells them that, look, you're just victim of circumstance here. And there's, ways out of it, and be patient, and et cetera, like that. Nobody knows the truth.
This is an interesting thing to think about, because you and I mean, I don't know if your publisher's told you. I mean, he told you I was a left podcast. I'm a Marxist.
That's all right.
What's funny about this is, like, we agree on a whole lot of this economic stuff against what's taught in neoclassical economics right now, particularly Keynesian forms of neoclassical economics, because one thing I've been saying is all this QE that's been going to these stockholders to keep the stocks invested was not going to flow out into the general economy like some kind of trickle down, whatever, which is not what people normally mean by that, but that seems to be the justification. And this policy has been maintained from Obama up through Trump, because Trump also put all of his faith in economic indicators in the stock market. But eventually, as supply chains and stuff break down, that fictitious value was going to flow out, like it was going to, like, and so inflation jumps from from 2 to 2.5% to something like, between what I've seen, 5 to 7%, depending on the certain sector, right? That's a serious problem. And what I've been pointing out is
much higher than that if you look at just the stock market or just the housing market. I mean, in Austin, Texas, you have housing prices are up by 35% from 1 year ago.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, well, you look at real assets, like are the things that people actually need in their daily life: housing, education, and hospitalization. It's all through the roof.
Those are the things that government is most involved in interfering in those markets and propping up those prices. I remember when Ron Paul was running for office in 2008. I forget the lady's name, but it wasn't Joy-Ann Reid. It was somebody else. It was on MSNBC, and it was these two black women, and one of them had been like the president of a college or something. I forgot what it was, but they had a clip of Ron Paul talking about the reason that college prices are so high is because government guarantees the tuition. Government will loan you X amount of money to pay, this much tuition. And so what happens is the schools just continually raise their prices higher and higher and higher and higher to match whatever it is that the government will pay. And so and that's why you have where the cost of cell phones is dropping through the floor, even in inflationary times. The price of an education is going up through the roof. It's because of the government intervention and thing. And then they clip back to the black lady, liberal MSNBC host, and they go, so time to ridicule this idiot, crotchety old white Republican from Texas, Ron Paul, and his idiotic thinking here. And she says, oh no, he's absolutely right about that. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I got anecdotes where we sit around and wait for the new numbers to come out. And as soon as the new numbers come out about how high the government, what level of tuition the government will pay in the student loans, we raise our price that day up to the limit of what they'll pay. And then it's the same thing, of course, with healthcare, is you have essentially supply in the form of the companies that own the hospitals and the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies. They're organized so they can use the levers of power to control the government, to regulate in a way to benefit themselves, but it doesn't pit them against each other. It pits them against us, against the customer, the patient. In this case, the sick patient is the one that the state and the companies are, ganging up against, where in the free market, they're at each other's throat to please us. Now, I know I'm not going to win you all the way over to laissez-faire today, but, I think in almost all these cases, in fact, even going back to Marx, and I'm not the world's greatest expert on Marx, but I know that I've read about, his complaints about warehouses full of goods that nobody wants and giant lines of men, standing around unemployed, waiting in a bread line and all, what is all this horrible misallocation of wealth and productivity and all this? But the answer was central banking. The answer was inflation was causing these massive distortions. And then the part that he was complaining about was the correction. And so, like you were saying about the Keynesians, like their model is that the economy is always just running along just fine. And then bad things happen. Recession kicks in because of animal spirits. Somebody asked John Maynard Keynes, hey man, what is it? He goes, it's animal spirits. Cause all of a sudden businessmen decide to stop making profits and instead all fall down dead because I guess how greedy they are or something, right? When the answer is no, man. The economy wasn't humming along perfect. The economy was in a period of artificially induced boom because of inflationary money. And then comes the very real correction back down to the level where we're trading with the actual wealth that we have, not just the paper money that's been increased in supply. And so, that's where the Keynesians just get all that completely backwards. But since I'm picking on Keynes, I think Marx made the same mistake. That he's looking at the consequences of the bust and he's not realizing that's caused by the boom. Same thing happened in the 1920s. I learned in school in like 7th grade that the Federal Reserve Bank was part of the New Deal. That we got all of that in the 1930s, and that the purpose of the Federal Reserve Bank was to smooth out the boom and the busts. So instead of having these giant waves, it would be much more cool because the monetary scientists would be in charge. But that ain't what happened. The Fed was created, the law was signed in 1913. The bank was created in 1914, and the New York Fed essentially was in the position of the ruler of them all at that time. And all through the 1920s, they were inflating. So prices, there's a massive increase in productivity and technology in the 1920s. Prices should have been falling across the board. But all the new inflation was keeping prices essentially steady. So people didn't realize that what they're looking at is a bubble because the prices should have been going down. And they were staying steady, but they were, in essence, in real terms, they were inflated to be way high compared to where they should be. And then this especially kicked in 1927 when the British were going broke over the wars in Africa. And Benjamin Strong, who was the head of the New York Fed, basically did a favor to the Bank of England and ramped up monetary inflation in order to prop up the pound. And then when he did that, a bunch of that liquid money went into the stock market. And that was what led to the real, kind of tulip mania type bubble in the stock market of 1928 and 29 that finally burst in toward the end of 29 and led to the start of the Depression. So it wasn't the wild excesses of laissez-faire free market capitalism that did it. It was the government manipulating the currency and making, keeping interest rates low and keeping the amounts of currency in circulation artificially high and leading to those distortions. And that happens over and over and over again. And I'm sorry, because I'm not sure how I got onto this. It's totally my fault that we're arguing about economics now. But
it's okay.
It's a big part of it, And look, one more thing about it, as long as I'm ranting about this. This is part of how they make the war seem free. How do you spend $10 trillion on a terror war without raising taxes? Well, you just inflate. In fact, in the Bush years, they sent people a $300 and $400 tax rebate check as though it was like a dividend from your share of the profits from invading Iraq. When the thing is a total loss. unless you work for Lockheed or own stock in Lockheed. But, in terms of the nation, we blew, $6-8 trillion in Iraq. The hell's he talking about? They make it seem like it's all to all of our benefit, when really it's to benefit the very few at the expense, not just of the people of the Middle East, but at our expense as well, not for our benefit.
There is a sense where I would agree with you on that last bit profoundly, because I have also been watching people talk about all these social welfare states, and as a very hardcore Marxist, I don't even like that. But I've been pointing out to people that there's a real cost to going to war for, I don't know, 20 years with a military that doesn't even have a budget accountability process. It doesn't. We don't know what it spends. The military doesn't know what it spends. It does. I mean, all the paper budgets they put us out, they put out there, that who knows if it, just, even the paper money they're spending is more like 10 times more than what China spends, 20 to 30 times more than what other major nations spend. But we also don't really know if that's actually accurate to what is being, the amount of monetary flows in that. And now these go into these weird public-private partnership things. That means that this money is being privately it's being captured not by even soldiers, but by contractors and servicers and this, that, and the other, who have no accountability even under the governmental processes that we'd normally have. So, I remember when the left cared about things like Blackwater, and now we don't hear it mentioned that much. This is a big problem because, whatever my criticisms of the government of China, and I have a few, I suspect actually, and this will bring us back to Afghanistan to end off on, that part of why Biden was finally able to convince enough of the establishment to let him pull out of Iraq wasn't out of the kindness of his heart, but because the whole pivot to Asia being picked back up, which people think goes back to Trump, but it goes back to the first Obama administration. Right. I mean, so it goes at least, I knew about it in 2011. So, and I think it goes back a little bit before that. It's something that people who follow Wonk World have known about.
Right.
Just like people being surprised that the U.S. government was negotiating with the Taliban. They've been negotiating with the Taliban off and on since 2009. At least.
No, not really. Obama. Okay. No, Obama. The only real effort Obama ever made to deal with the Taliban was dealing with a total imposter, a guy who was pretending to be Mullah Mansour and just walking off with giant piles of cash. And when they never really deal with Mullah Mansour whatsoever, and they kept as a condition that if you want to deal with us, you got to talk with the Afghan government too, which was always a deal killer for the Taliban that considered the Kabul government completely illegitimate, which of course it was. Anyway, sorry, not to correct you.
No.
The only real negotiations with the Taliban began in 2018 on Trump's insistence. And I think you're 100% right, though, that the way that the argument that they used to do it was, we have to focus on China instead. We can't be piddling around, patrolling the Helmand province when we got to pivot to Asia here. But, the whole thing is so stupid. In fact, if you look at the lack of coverage of Afghanistan now, and they'll talk about, well, there's still some Americans who were left behind who we want to get out or something like that, or the Taliban are being cruel to women or something. But in terms of the United States of America's strategic interest, even as a world empire, it doesn't make any difference at all who rules Afghanistan. It's essentially meaningless, a meaningless distinction, whether the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and the Hazaras have their ruling coalition, or whether the Pashtuns have theirs. And if I told your audience that these live in the south and those live in the north, they wouldn't know the difference. And if I told you that these were dominant and those were now on the outs, they wouldn't know the difference either. No offense to your audience. Maybe some of them know all about who's a Pashtun and who's an Uzbek. But I'm just saying, the American people don't know. And because it doesn't make any difference at all. If we had the same conversation about, oh no, did you hear there was a coup in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan? That also doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. And, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's, Mr. Graybeard, Rockefeller guy, Council on Foreign Relations guy, the brainchild behind the, America's Cold War in Eastern Europe and in Afghanistan in the late Carter years and all of that. He wrote in 1997 in his book, The Grand Chessboard, about, ensuring American primacy in the world, however you put it. He says, listen, and he says this over and over again in there. He goes, look, America's interest in Afghanistan is clear. We must support the China-Pakistan Taliban axis in order to keep Iran, Russia, and India out. Well, that's the exact opposite of the war we've been fighting the last 20 years. The last 20 years, we've been fighting for Iran's friends, the Hazaras, the Russians' friends, the Tajiks, and the Uzbeks, and the Indians' friends, I guess the Tajiks and the Uzbeks as well. In order to what? To keep the Taliban, Pakistan, and China out. So what difference does it make if we switch back? What difference does it make if we switch back from the Zbigniew Brzezinski policy, from the George W. Bush policy, back to the Brzezinski policy? It doesn't make any damn difference to the American people whether Iran or whether China has more influence in Afghanistan. It just doesn't matter. And in fact, you look at the irony here, where if the Taliban decide that, because look, they're only the plurality of the country, but they're not the majority population of the country. They're like 40% trying to rule 60 right now. And the people that they're going to have the most problem getting along with are going to be the Shiite Hazaras. Well, guess what? Iran has a major interest in protecting the Shiite Hazaras. Does that mean America's going to get in bed with Iran to protect their friends, the Hazaras, who they attempted to prop up in power for the last 20 years that they've now abandoned? Or does that mean that the Hazaras have always been the bad guys because they're friends with Iran? And now they're sorry that they tried to put them in power for the last 20 years? The whole thing is nonsensical. For people in your audience who think that I sound nonsensical, that's the policy I'm describing. This is the middle part of North America in the middle part of Eurasia. It makes no sense. It never did.
I have pointed out to people that U.S. foreign policy seems incoherent if you try to look at it from like the idea that they have specific strategic objectives and specific group goals. But if you just assume that they're sowing chaos to maintain economic power, then it pretty much, and by that I mean like the government sponsored stuff maintains economic power, that it makes sense. Like that's about the only way you can explain it, because there's like, if you have a strategic orientation towards a specific group, they change. So, it's actually, as you pointed out, in Afghanistan, just in the 20 years of the war, our strategic interests have changed, and the other sides have changed too. I mean, and the beginning you had BRICS and like India, China, and Russia were copacetic, and now Russia's kind of copacetic with China, but at odds with India. China's definitely at odds with India. Like the things have shifted dramatically in the geopolitical landscape. And yet
that goes to show, that's a great point right there too, that for all the people who cry that like, when, if we don't rule the world, then China will, or Russia will. Well, what's the evidence for that? Why would Russia, with the GDP the size of Massachusetts, be able to do a better job ruling America than us, have any more success ruling the world than us? And how could Putin possibly be as stupid as Dick Cheney and George W. Bush to go off biting off that much more than he could chew in the first place? I mean, look at the Chinese. What are they going to do? March into India? Try to take all those mountains and get into a nuclear war over it? No, they're not. Neither are they going to attack Japan. You know, I guess there's a possibility they could roll into Outer Mongolia. But, you know, from what I've read of American intervention in Outer Mongolia, I think that probably would be a defensive move on their part. At the end of the day, I'd be more suspicious that the Americans had provoked the damn thing if that happened. But, you know, they have plenty of their own problems trying to rule Tibet and Xinjiang and Hong Kong and, you know, all of the rest of their internal problems. You know, they're not coming here. They're not even a threat to our friends. I mean, you couldn't find one serious foreign policy person anywhere in Japan who thinks that the Chinese are going to invade Japan and think that they have a plan even in 100 years to invade Japan. Nobody thinks that. They're not going to. It's just not in the cards. So, in other words, and this is the part that I think Americans have the most trouble with, is realizing that it doesn't have to be this way at all. That even if you buy the entire logic of the Cold War, we could have completely disarmed when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. We'd already befriended the Chinese 15 years before that. And they still, you know, fly the red flag, but this is essentially the right wing of the Communist Party over there. And we've been getting along with them for now 50 years. There's no almost 50 years. There's no reason for us to have any kind of, you know, permanent adversarial relationship with either of these nations. And then just look at the world. There's no power in Latin America. There's no power in Africa. All the powers of Europe are our close friends. The Indians are, you know, potentially powerful, but the way that they run things in their society, they're not, you know, certainly not a wealthy country, and they're not making any kind of move to build up an aggressive military force other than maybe for confronting Pakistan with, but certainly not to be a global force, a blue water navy and anything like that. Same for China. Japan has spent, they had their world empire days, and those days are long gone now. Nobody thinks Japan's going to rise back up and try to dominate Asia again. And then that's it. Spin the globe. There's a big old Pacific Ocean, and then you're back in North America again. That's everybody. Who are we going to fight next? The lost continent of Atlantis? Or the guys from Mars Attacks? There's nobody left to fight. As Ron Paul told the Washington Post, we could defend this country with a couple of good submarines. And whatever problems that we do have in the world where there really is a threat to peace, like, say, India and Pakistan's dispute over Kashmir, which China does have their fingers in that a bit too, that, you know what? Let's have a peace conference then, damn it. Let's do everything we can to figure out a state of autonomy for Kashmir that everybody can live with. What else are we doing with our lives, if not that? That's not a reason, you know. I keep making the same complaint. Sorry, various audiences. I'm a broken record on this, but all this new controversy over we're selling some nuclear-powered subs to Australia. We've never done this before, not in the days of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We shared our stuff with the Brits, but not the Australians. Well, now we're going to do this. So I'm reading about it, and the article says, well, you know, in the time it takes, and this is no critical article, this is just the Wall Street Journal or whatever reporting it was. Just, you know, regular hard news story. Well, by the time we're done transferring the technology over there and building up their infrastructure to be able to deal with these type of submarines, and by the time we're done training up the Australians and how to use this technology, it's going to be 2050. Right? So just, in other words, it's just baked in that, of course, we're going to have this Cold War adversarial naval relationship with China for the next 30 years, at least. And nobody thinks that, hey, by the year 2050, we will have shaken hands with the Chinese so many times and broken noodles with them so many times that to ever fight them would be unthinkable. By 2050, we're going to have finished pivot our friendliness power to Asia policy so completely that we won't need a single submarine in the Pacific because everybody's security is all guaranteed by agreement and verification. We gave up our nukes. We gave up our offensive capability because we don't need it. Alderaan is peaceful. There's nothing here to fight about. How about that for a plan for 2050? Instead of, oh yeah, no, definitely we're going to embark on this tens of billions of dollar operation so that in another 25 years from now, we'll be able to have these assets in place for a potential confrontation then. It's madness. And it's also obviously a racket. It's obviously also just a completely cynical enterprise that is run with the interests of the ship makers and bomb manufacturers and the Pentagon itself in mind, not the security of the American people whatsoever.
So I guess I have one last question, and then we'll end this off. I know that there have been libertarians who've stayed on the course during this time period, particularly under Trump. But how has it seems like a whole lot of them have also gotten off script or gotten lost in the wilderness. I think about like not a libertarian magazine, but American Conservative, which tended to be libertarian friendly-ish, has seemed like it doesn't even know what to do to pivot during the Trump years about its anti-war stances. It's also seemed lost, and that's kind of new. Why do you think that happened with some of the libertarians? Was it just the allure of power?
I mean, the last time the libertarians were bad on the wars was right at the height of the hype getting us into Iraq War II. Mm-hmm. You had some people who called themselves the liberventionists.
The objectivist, right?
Yeah, they're they're the worst of them. But there were some others, and they're essentially arguing. Some of the guys at Reason argued that, September 11 proves it. We got to liberalize the whole world. You can't have freedom in just one country. And, adopted this kind of Trotskyite idea of permanent revolution. But that was so quickly discredited by the war itself, if nothing else. And to stick up for the movement a little bit, the vast majority of the libertarian movement was completely solid on this stuff at the time. You'd hear allowances for Afghanistan because people didn't really realize we had the opportunity to negotiate there. We had the opportunity to have an extremely limited war against bin Laden only and not against the Taliban, that kind of thing. But mostly libertarians have been solid on this. In the Trump years, there are a lot of libertarians who, vastly preferred him, not just to the Democrats, but to the Republican establishment as well. Remember, he stopped Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton in one year and never was a governor, never was a senator, never was a part of the Republican Party establishment. Essentially, he was this rogue who was famous enough and rich enough to be able to pull it off and get in there, and was, essentially used by the American people as a giant middle finger, not just to Hillary Clinton, but to the entire establishment. Norm Macdonald said, the American people hated Hillary Clinton so much that they elected somebody they hate even more than her just to make the point and rub it in, and so I think there was a lot. Hey, man, I'll tell you what, on election night 16, we were gratified as hell to see the butcher of Waco lose. Oh, my God. It didn't matter who beat her. All that mattered was that Hillary Clinton was never going to be the president of this country. Oh, my God, what a relief. And there's so many people who felt that way about that whole thing. And after all, Trump talks a good game half the time. And he's got a specific tactic that he very deliberately uses, where he's just on all sides of all issues all the time. So if you're not hip to that, you can hear him say things you like sometimes. I promise I will protect Social Security more and better than any president ever. And also, boy, all these entitlement programs got to go. They're too expensive, and we got to cut taxes and get rid of these things. And so whichever your position is on Social Security, you go, you know what? At least he's good on Social Security, right? Or, what we're going to do, we're going to end all these wars. We never should have been in the Middle East. It's the worst thing anybody ever did, and screw that, and you're stupid if you ever believed in it too, and how do you like that? And also, we're going to crush ISIS. We're going to annihilate them. We're going to torture their family members. And even if we can't get good information out of them, we're going to torture them anyway just because they deserve it. And on and on. So if you're some insane hawk or some, especially if you're an Israel firster, then, we're going to stick it to the Ayatollah. We're going to be so hard on Iran. And so he's got everything you need. But then if you're a Ron Paul guy and you want to hear a right-winger say some anti-war stuff, then you go, wow, did you hear the anti-war stuff he said? And in fact, because he's Donald Trump, he's so hyperbolic. He's like, listen, going to the Middle East was the worst decision any American president ever made on any issue ever. I mean, goes to show what he knows. But anyway, like when you say it like that, that's really appealing to people who like stuff like that, you know? And so he offered people enough to believe in there. And I think, you know, a lot of conservatives or a lot of, you know, right wingers of one stripe or another were very happy to have the Bushes gone and to have somebody in there to disrupt the whole thing. Now, as far as the American Conservative Magazine, I mean, they have undergone some changes and they have some new people in charge. And in fact, one of the new editors who was in charge over there, I talked to him recently, and he's not in charge over there anymore. So I actually don't know who's running the store at TAC right now. I know they're still running some of my favorites, but also they did get rid of Kelly Vlahos and Daniel Larison. I think they're still running Peter Van Buren though. And, you know, I read something the other day that was like, it was actually perfect right-wing hawkishness, right? Like I would not run it at antiwar.com because he had some flaws in it. Like, yeah, sure, we should still sell weapons to Taiwan or something like that. But otherwise he was saying the crisis is here. Forget China. And really, like, the more right-wing he is on any other thing, for my purposes, the better. Because I really don't care what anybody's bad on except the wars. I mean, within limits, right? But if you're like a good anti-immigration, moderately like anti-China feeling conservative, but you're telling other conservatives, who cares about China, man? What are they going to do? Nothing. Let's pay attention to what matters here. Then that's what matters the most to me. You know, and I think, you know, any kind of conservative anti-imperialism we can get out of the right, we ought to cherish and boost and highlight and show people that, you know, this mythology, you got to be some kind of leftist, no offense, to be anti-war. Well, as you start out this whole show, yeah, the left are not so reliably anti-war. Somebody's got to be, you know, it's going to be, if it has to be the libertarians and the conservatives, somebody's got to tell the truth about this. And why it doesn't have to be this way. And in fact, you know, liberals and leftists, they may not prioritize foreign policy in the ways that we want, but the default presumption is that they're anti-war. And so if anybody really is the base that supports war in this country, it's Republican voters, you know, the Tea Party, as you called them earlier, right? So the question is, well, how do they feel about it? Do they believe in this one, or are they really cynical about it? The next time Biden wants to bomb somebody, are they going to be mad? Are they going to say, well, at least he's bombing somebody, right? And then the next time a Republican president bombs somebody, are they going to be mad? Are they going to say, yeah, that's our leader, the tough guy? So a lot hinges on that. You know, I'm of the opinion that the American people's opinion doesn't matter at all on almost every issue. It's, you know, organized power factions that matter. But on war, you got to at least have the right. You know, the Powell Doctrine was you have to have the entire American people united. The Bush Jr. Doctrine was we'll settle for half. You know, and the Obama Doctrine was we'll settle for drones and hope the American people don't pay too much attention. Well, he did a massive escalation in Afghanistan and lots of CIA stuff. I don't want to play that down, but we'll do clandestine type stuff mostly that people won't notice. But then, you know, at this point, and especially a lot in large measure because of the rhetoric of Donald Trump that he used against Jeb Bush, you know, he did a lot by talking that way to move the American right against war and intervention and policing the world, as they call it, that kind of thing. So that's something to be capitalized on. For people who really do care about this stuff a lot, I think that's the most important thing. You know, I've always said, sorry, I'm rambling, but it always seemed to me a shame that Veterans for Peace was called Veterans for Peace instead of Veterans Against War. Because peace just sounds feminine and weak and stupid. I'm sorry, it does. And I'm the anti-war guy. I'm the editor of antiwar.com. But I got to say, like I admit, peace sounds hopeful, right? It sounds unrealistic, right? Mm-hmm. What we need, and Veterans for Peace sounds like we were tough guys, now we're not. We were conservatives, now we're liberals. And look, we even have a dove on our logo, you know? And I think that's just suicide. Why even bother? Why even bother if you're going to play into a stereotype of a bunch of 1960s hippie crap? You know, what we need is veterans who come home from the war and become anti-war. Never mind what you think about global warming, right? No, never mind what you think about all these wedge issues, these partisan wedge issues. You know, what people need to hear is that you went to war and then you got smart, not you moved left. And so when you have groups like Bring Our Troops Home and Concerned Veterans of America, who are these more conservative sounding anti-war guys, you can tell when you're dealing with them. In a fight, they'll help you. These guys are tough guys. It's just they used to be dumb and now they're smart. They once fell for it. Now they know better. And they're here to help other conservatives, especially, to know better and understand why. And I think that's the kind of thing, you know, they call what, culture jamming or whatever, right? Find the problem spot. Find the place where the work is needed most and focus on that. And so, you know, something we can be very grateful for Ron Paul for doing. And for that matter, we can be very thankful for Donald Trump for talking that way too, and getting right-wingers' brains turning on those issues, you know, looking at it from the correct perspective.
Well, thank you for coming on, Scott. Thank you for going into, I wanted to say enemy territory, because on these issues we're actually not enemies, but
not at all, man. Happy to do it.
But on different territories. I'm actually glad that you explained a lot of your economic and thinking too, because even if we don't agree, we need to understand how different parts of American society and different political views actually think.
Right.
Because,
and look, overall, we shouldn't be sectarians. There's two kinds of people in this world: government employees and everybody else. Okay. There's the power, and then there's the people. Okay. And so whether you're a left winger or whether you're a right winger or whether you're a libertarian, it's pretty obvious, just like we were talking about with Edwards, Obama, and Hillary on one side of the stage, and Kucinich and Gravel way over there. Right. We don't want Kucinich and Gravel fighting, do we? We don't want to have sectarianism between the good guys. It's an emergency. We don't have time for that crap. So good leftists like you who puts anti-imperialism first, good enough for me, pal. We'll argue about this other stuff we disagree about later.
yeah,
You know,
thank you.
war and torture and mass murder and imperial suicide. You know, that's what is the priority for me by far. So.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on, and have a great day, Scott.
Great. Thank you for having me, man. Really appreciate it.
All right.